Hello, my fellow risers. Perfect. All right, so we are live on YouTube, Twitch, and Kick. Excellent. Okie dokie. That's spooling. All right, I guess no worries. All right, very good. Let's do it here. Where is it? Where is the stream, bro? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, here we go. Great. All right. Okay, on that phone it's garbage, but on this phone it's definitely legible. So we're ready to go. And music is going. All right, we're good. So, all right, hello, my fellow risers, and welcome back. We are reading Losing Ourselves, and we are interviewing the author next week. In less than 7 days, we have to finish this. And then so that on Tuesday we can just discuss it and come up with questions. So today we're gonna finish reading chapter 5. And then I think we're also gonna try to read chapter 6, and we may even also try to read chapter 7. All right, so in sort of just a quick review. So this book is about how the self is an illusion, how you basically don't exist, or at least not in any way that you thought you did. Your mode of existence is as what we call a person, as what the author calls a person, rather than as a self. So in the first chapter, a few days ago, all right, so we did Who Do You Think You Are? What a Self Is, and Why You Think You Have One. And then, so I just had that page open. What we mean by a self. Unitary, the witness of all that we perceive, the agent of our actions, and throughout this book, he talks about both Western schools, from a couple centuries ago, schools of thought from a couple centuries ago, contemporary Western philosophers on either side of the issue of whether there is a self or whether it's an illusion. Of course, again, this author being on the side that it is an illusion. So whether you call it the Atman, the ego, the soul, the spirit, what have you, it's all basically the same thing because we all across the world and throughout, throughout recent time, we're all descendants of people that had to evolve this illusion of a self, which is why whether it's self, soul, or Atman, it's all basically the same thing. So first, we define the self, then why you have no self, the view from Buddhism, philosophy, and science, specifically, of course, neuroscience. Chapter 3, what you really are, recovering and discovering the person. So you're this set of properties that we conventionally label as with the same label that we conventionally consider continuous, even if this Eris and the Eris from 10 minutes ago or the Eris from 10 years ago are not actually numerically identical. The cells are different, the activity is different. Yeah. But the sort of the role, or let's say the label, is continuous. So then in chapter 4, we he went into more detail with arguments for the self, specifically arguments for the most ridiculous concept of the self, the magical, the transcendental self, the self that stands behind the body and the mind, that possesses the body and mind, but is neither of those. That is distinct from those. The self that is outside of space and time. Just the absolute garbage intuitive sense of self that we have. And now we're in chapter 5, which we started yesterday, looking at Strawson's arguments about awareness and all that was bullshit about. Remember, he said that if you're aware of something, then just by being aware of that, you're also aware of the awareness of it without any additional mechanism activating, running, or as we would say in my vocabulary, livering. Um, and so then, so we did that, the transcendent self in the previous chapter. So whatever I just said was wrong. We did the transcendent self in the previous chapter. In this chapter with the minimal self, that's where we saw Strawson. Yeah. Okay. And that's just Strawson just going, all right, fine. You're right. Transcendent self is bullshit, but I still feel like a unitary singular self with direct access to my thoughts and so on. Um, is this sentence relevant? That is the fallacy of going from the mere fact of awareness to the existence of a subject of awareness. So he's still asserting there's got to be some singular subject of awareness. So this is in the minimal self, okay? But whether it's the minimal self, which is just kind of a lighter weight version, or whether it's the transcendent self, all of this philosophical bullshit is just, as Jay Garfield says, philosophical elaborations on our intuitive conviction. So I think that I can find that line, and I'm going to read that line, and then let's read the last 3 paragraphs that we had read at the end of the last video, and then we're going to move on. Where we're picking off is this is not the only kind of argument from reflexivity for the existence of the self. Evan Thompson, bop, bop, bop. All right, so let's go back, read just the last 3 paragraphs from yesterday in chapter 5. The self strikes back to the minimal self. So after this, talking about Strawson and how it's bullshit. In fact, I'm going to read the last 4 paragraphs. We're going to start at the top of the page here. Okay, here we go. Oh, and by the way, of course, to see the interview, subscribe so that you can catch that when that come out. All right, so I think that this conclusion, that all awareness involves an awareness of myself, is implausible on its face. When I introspect and notice that I am experiencing a headache or seeing a sunset, this may deliver awareness of the headache or of my perceptual state, but it's a real stretch to say that it also delivers awareness of a subject standing behind those states. And if I am truly immersed in that experience, my own subjectivity is the furthest thing from my mind, but we'll return to this point in chapter 6. If I am just a stream of psychophysical processes, there may be nothing beyond that stream of which to be aware. That is the view that I have been defending. To simply presume that there is something that lies behind it is once again to assume the conclusion that Strawson is trying to establish. Okay, circular, begging the question. This has been a long train of reasoning. So let us now sum up what is wrong with Strawson's attempt to rehabilitate the self. His argument, like those we considered in the previous chapter, is transcendental in form. It presumes that the framework of subject-object duality is an accurate representation of the basic structure of experience, and then asks what we must be like in order for experience to be necessarily so structured. In this case, we see that the premise, the explanandum, is to be rejected. It is one thing to say that we habitually thematize our experience through the framework of subject-object duality, at least when we are introspective, and another to say that we simply find that duality in experience itself. Okay, it's all just objects interacting with each other. There's not this magical subject that then has this relationship to substantial or objects of substance, substantial objects that then have properties. This is probably just how we conceive of the world, not how the world actually is. And we shouldn't be assuming that how we conceive of the world is actually how it is. It's just sort of a way that has advantages when dealing with the world. Okay? So in this case, we see that the premise, the explanandum, is to be rejected. It is one thing to say that we habitually thematize our experience through this framework of subject-object duality, at least when we are introspective, and another to say that we simply find that duality in experience itself. The only legitimate explanandum is our commitment to the subject-object framework, not the framework itself. And that commitment can be explained as a cognitive illusion, taking a feature of our experience that our mind constructs and superimposes for one that we just discover. There is therefore no argument here for the reflexivity of awareness, and so no argument on that basis for the reality of the self. Put the demonic book away and read the Bible, get a job so we aren't paying taxes alone. Absolutely, bro. Also, do something meaningful with your life so that I don't have to do all of the culture progressing alone. So that we philosophers don't have to find all that alone while you do nothing of real importance. To accept Strawson's argument would be like noticing that we see the two lines of the Mueller-Lyer illusion to be of different lengths, and then trying to figure out how the arrowheads lengthened one and shortened the other. A better option would be to ask what it is about our perceptual system that leads us to see them that way, despite the fact that we know that they are of equal length. Hold on, I want to make sure I have the chat up on this screen because I might not glance over there. All right, very good. So, all right. Hello, Om Namaste to you for coming. And then Elder Our Jedi. Oh, that's so funny that that's his name, Elder Our Jedi. Um, I don't. I think you need to watch Star Wars again. Um, that's so funny. Especially I'm guessing you're probably in one of the Western empires, and doing your best to support it and ignore the actual important things in life and world. Okay, so a better option would be to ask what it is about our perceptual system that leads us to see them that way, despite the fact that we know they are of equal length. This takes us back to the sense in which the self and the subject-object duality with which it is imbricated, which we learned yesterday means that they overlap, are illusions. They are the way we take ourselves and our experience to be, not the way that we or our experience actually exist. To take what is illusory to exist in the way it appears is like assuming that there must be some depth to the water in a mirage, and that it can quench our thirst. Okay. Great. Before we move on, I was hoping to see the line about how it's just post hoc elaborations of our intuition. And philosophical elaborations of our intuition. Because it's just so dismissive. I just really liked that line. All right, I guess I'm not going too find it. And I guess I'm just having a... You know what? I can find it, actually. I can find it, actually. I just need a second. You can come back in a minute because I just have to... I have to open up my Kindle so that I can search. All right, give me a second. All right, Kindle, losing ourselves. All right, search, great. Okay, here we go. Philosophical elaborations. Yep. So it is in chapter 5 on page 70 in the Kindle version. Yeah. Okay, great. So back when he was first presenting Strawson's argument, he says, let us see how this argument is meant to go and just what is wrong with it. We will explore it in considerable detail as it is such a clear and explicit argument for this thesis, and careful attention to it will shed light on the confusions at the heart of both the instinctive self-illusion and the philosophical elaborations of that illusion. So, okay, I really like that line. All right, here we go. All right, who's ready? All right, you ready, Let's do it. And you ready, Jedi? We can be friends. We can, I know you have to believe that nothing matters outside of your 9 to 5 and paying taxes, but we can be friends and learn about other things together. Okay, so this is not the only kind of argument from reflexivity for the existence of the self to gain traction in recent discussions. Evan Thompson develops a different argument for reflexivity for the existence of the self, an argument with roots in classical India due originally to the Buddhist philosopher Dignaga. This argument, although similar to Strawson's in its commitment to reflexivity, understands reflexivity differently, not as the explicit awareness of one's own subjectivity, but as a merely implicit sense of ownership of one's own experiences. Despite this difference in detail, the arguments are very similar in form, and our reply will be very similar. Well, this characterization of Dignaga and Evan Thompson as merely an implicit sense of ownership. Oh no, I still reject that. The problem is this implicit sense, because I'm thinking that implicit probably means that, again, there's no additional mechanism that has to be involved for that sense of ownership, and that to me don't make much sense. So Dinaga argues not for the existence of the self. After all, he was a Buddhist and so committed to the doctrine of no self, but simply for the reflexivity of awareness. Okay? Dinaga argues for the reflexivity of awareness. Nonetheless, just as Strawson uses reflexivity as an argument for the self, Thompson updates Dinaga's version of that argument into an argument for the reality of the self. Sounds like he perverted Dinaga's version. So anyway, twisted it to use it against progress. So the argument has two connected parts. The first of which is the Buddhist argument for the reflexivity of awareness, mobilized by Dignaga, and the second of which is the direct argument that this reflexivity entails the reality of a self. Okay? So this is Thompson. All right, very good. So here's part 1. Okay? A version of Dignaga. When I remember last night's sunset, I remember my seeing last night's sunset. That is one memory, not two. And the memory is the retrieval of that experience. Since it is one memory, the proponent of reflexivity argues there was one experience. So the experience of the sunset and the experience of my seeing the sunset must be the same. Okay. Therefore, Therefore, every experience is also an experience of my having that experience. All right, so if part one is successful, and I will argue shortly that it is not, it gets us to the conclusion that all perceptual experience is also experience of experience, and that is the reflexivity thesis. To get from there to the self, Thompson adds the following steps. All right. So this is part two. Okay. So here are the following steps to get from well, that constitute part two to get from the reflexivity thesis to the reality of a self. The only way that I can remember last night's sunset, as opposed to fantasizing about it, is to be the same subject now, oh boy, as the subject who experienced the sunset. So he just has no concept of how memory works. Got you, got you, got you. The only way that I can remember last night's sunset is to be the same subject now as the subject who experienced the sunset. And in virtue of that fact, the same subject who experienced my experience of that sunset. That is, the I who experienced the experience of the sunset and the I who now experiences the memory must be the same I. I could not, for instance, remember your experience of that sunset. Well, I mean, I could if I, for instance, obviously, if you just transplant the memory, and then, but we're going to be in the weeds soon, so let me be careful. I could not, for instance, remember your experience of that sunset. Thus, the I that is the subject must endure through time and must be a self. This is part two. Okay. So the only way that I can remember last night's sunset is to be the same subject who experienced the sunset, same subject who experienced my experience of the sunset. Okay, so that's all part two. Great. Unfortunately for the defender of the self, each of these two sub-arguments is fallacious. Damn, both of them. Part one relies on a radical misunderstanding of how memory works. Yeah, a misunderstanding that was even evident to many medieval Indian and Tibetan philosophers, to many medieval philosophers. That misunderstanding involves taking memory to be a straightforward retrieval in the mind of a past experience, like a reactivation of the past perception or the recovery of a photocopy of that experience. But that is not how memory works. It is not the representation, or I guess that's representation, of a preserved experience stored and then re-examined when called to mind. Instead, it is a reconstruction of the past. I am going to pronounce that representation. Because there's different connotations with representation and a literal representation of the original thing. But that is not how memory works. It is not the representation of a preserved experience stored and then examined when called to mind. Instead, it is a reconstruction of the past, or in other words, a cognitive fabrication. And remember the interesting thing we talked about the etymology of fiction and fact, both coming from the same Latin, fingere. Successful memory is not the careful preservation of an image, newsreel, or a text in the mind, but rather a successful reconstruction of a past event. Errors in memory are not degradations in a photograph kept on file. They are instead the construction of an account of the past that is at odds with what actually happened. This does not mean that memory is just imagination. There is a difference, but this difference concerns only the distinct causal ancestries of a present cognitive state. Okay? The only difference between a memory and imagination is that there are different causal mechanisms that lead to what you're currently doing, whether it's a memory or an imagination. Perceptual experience is more salient as a cause of memory than of imagination. But this is a difference of degree, not of kind. To be a memory is only to be the effect of a particular kind of causal chain originating in an experience. The intermediate steps in that chain include a host of brain and cognitive processes of which we are largely unaware and which are each responsible for any memory we construct, even though that construction may feel like just the retrieval of an intact perceptual snapshot. All right, very good. All memory is thus somewhat imaginative. All imagination relies on memory. So even when I do actually construct a memory that thematizes my own subjectivity, that is no argument for the claim that the subjectivity was thematized in the original experience, and so no argument for reflexivity. All right, let's read that again. All memory is thus somewhat imaginative. All imagination relies on memory. So even when I do actually construct a memory that thematizes my own subjectivity, that like incorporates in the construction my subjective awareness of the thing being remembered, that's not an argument for the claim that the subjectivity was thematized in the original experience. Okay, it's thematized in that construction. It doesn't mean that it was thematized in the original experience. And so, no argument for reflexivity. I'm not sure I understand that. So once again, even if we adopt this thinner notion of reflexive awareness advocated by Thompson, there is no reason to think that all awareness is reflexive. And so this argument for the existence of the self fails as well. So once again, even if we adopt this thinner notion of reflexive awareness that Thompson advocates, there's still no reason to think that all awareness actually is reflexive. Yeah, that still hasn't been demonstrated. Okay. Very good. Now let's go back to this real quick. So no argument for reflexivity. So is this the same thing as is in the next sentence and I'm just not getting it? So toxic. Very good. So even when I do actually construct a memory that thematizes my own subjectivity, that is no argument for the claim that that subjectivity was thematized in the original experience, and so no argument for reflexivity. Right, right. Because in order for it to be an argument for reflexivity, that subjectivity would have to be thematized in the original experience, and that's why it's also in the memory, rather than that it's when the memory is reconstructed that the subjectivity gets included. Okay, I think that's right. I don't know how well I'm integrating that idea, but okay, I think I've stated it correctly. Okay, so, but even if we were to grant the reflexivity of experience, for the sake of argument, this would not get us anywhere near an argument for the existence of the self. This is because, so this argument for the existence of the self fails as well, because there's no reason to think that all, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's also an important step. But even if we were to grant the reflexivity of experience for the sake of argument, this would not get us anywhere near an argument for the existence of the self. This is because the second part of the argument is equally fallacious, as Buddhist proponents of reflexivity in classical India also pointed out. For once again, if we see memory as the outcome of a sequence of cognitive processes, even if we grant that one can only remember one's own experiences, everything hinges on what one is. Everyone in this debate will grant that to remember last night's sunset now, I must be the same person who saw that sunset last night, but that does not entail that I am a self. As we have seen, that would require that some single thing persists as the basis of that psychophysical continuum from last night to tonight, some underlying substance. Nothing in the argument is even relevant to that supposition, though. All that the second part of the argument gets me is the continuity of a sequence of cognitive events, starting with the perception of the sunset and ending with my memory of the sunset. That is no different in principle from the sequences involved in institutional memory we discussed in chapter 4, right? You don't need a single human being that is consistent for instance, a corporation to have memory of its founding. You don't actually need someone that was there at the founding and it is here now to recall that. You don't need to be the same person. So that kind of continuity is consistent with my being a selfless person. The memory argument, hence, would also fail to establish the existence of a self, even if we granted the reflexivity claim. Okay, so let's briefly take stock of where we are in this discussion. We are addressing contemporary arguments, albeit with classical antecedents, for the existence of a minimal self. A self that is meant to be less robust than a substantial self, but nonetheless a unified, continuing subject of experience and agent of action distinct from mind and body. Okay, this is this minimal self. Supposed to be less robust, but it's got some of the biggest, most significant aspects of that transcendental, substantial self. So we have examined two versions of arguments for such a self that depend on the idea of the reflexivity of awareness, and we have found them wanting. We will now turn to three examples of a second approach to argue. We will now turn to three examples of a second approach to arguing for the existence of a minimal self, each of which originates in the European phenomenological tradition, in order of an increasingly minimal conception of that self and its basis. The first of these depends on the idea that all of our experience has a special property of forminess. The second depends upon the idea that there is a special kind of intransitive or immediate self-consciousness that discloses the self to us. The third appeals to pre-reflective self-awareness. We will consider and reject each of these mother suckers. Finally, we will address a fourth, somewhat different approach to defending a minimal self, the idea that the self is a narrative construction. All right, so that's going to be 4. So 1, 2, 3. So arguing for the existence of a minimal self originating in the European phenomenological tradition. And here you go, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so now let's see 1. All right, so Dan Zahavi, Dan Zahavi presents an argument for the existence of the self that is grounded on what he calls the forminess or mineness of experience. It is instructive that he uses this terminology, as it emphasizes that he is in fact defending the very target of the Buddhist arguments against a self that we examined in chapter 2. Buddhist philosophers in India and Tibet often characterize the view that there is a self as the twofold self-grasping, or the grasping onto I and being mine. All right, so we have this forminess versus this twofold self-grasping. The second term in this phrase expresses the idea that the objects of experience or the components of the person must be understood in relation to an independent subject, and they must be owned by subjectivity. That subjectivity is the self. Here's how Zahavi puts it. If we compare the perception of a green apple with the recollection of a yellow lemon, there has been a change of both the object and the intentional type. Does such a change leave nothing unchanged in the experiential flow? Is the difference between the first experience and the last experience as radical as the difference between my current experience and the current experience of someone else? We should deny this. Whatever this type, whatever that object, there is something that the different experiences have in common. Not only is the first experience retained by the last experience, but the different experiences are all characterized by the same fundamental first person character. They are all characterized by what we might call a dimension of for meanness or mindness. So Zahavi argues here that whatever distinguishes our various experiences on the object side, eggs versus apples, whiteness versus redness, our own experiences have something in common on the subject side that the experiences of others all lack, namely for meanness or mindness. This is a crucial step in his larger argument, since this for meanness is a direct relation to a minimal self. There must, he argues, be a minimal self. So this is a crucial step. Let's review. Ohm says, Advaita Vedanta. It focuses on shifting one's identification from the active limited experiencer, ego/mind, to the inactive, unlimited witness, the self. Okay, understood. No experience in reality. In the ultimate non-dual state, paramarthika, the self is not experiencing anything because there is no second thing to be experienced. It is pure, undifferentiated consciousness. Therefore, while the individual, jiva, feels like the experiencer, Advaita teaches that the ultimate reality is the witness, self behind that experience. Okay, understood. But beyond experience, is there evidence? Is there experiment? Because experiment, in my book, beats experience every time. Okay, so Zahavi argues that whatever distinguishes our various experiences on the object side, whatever like distinguishes an egg from an apple, whatever makes those things different, or what makes whiteness and redness different, regardless, our own experiences have something in common on the subject side that the experiences of others all lack. Experiences of others. I'm not sure what that means. Is that supposed to be experiences of objects? I'm not sure what that means. Or like other people's, other subjects' experiences. Oh, versus our own experiences. I don't understand this, but I think that's going to be okay, actually, because it's all right. Oh, I know the Buddhist teachings are different. Yes. And do you believe in like absolute or objective truth, regardless of how easy it is to know? Like, is there value in identifying error in teachings about reality and trying to filter teachings to get to something, to get to the most usable thing that seems to best represent reality? So this is a crucial step in his larger argument, and this crucial step, I'm not sure I understand, since this for meanness is a direct relation to a minimal self, there must, he argues, be such a minimal self. Okay, Zahavi characterizes this elusive property as follows. The for meanness or mindness in question is not a quality like scarlet, sour, or soft. It doesn't refer to a specific experiential content, to a specific what. Rather, it refers to the distinct givenness or how of experience. It refers to the first personal presence of experience. All right, I'm dropping the accent so I can make sure I can try to understand this. Rather, so the for meness or mineness in question is not a quality like scarlet, sour, or soft. It doesn't refer to a specific experiential content, to a specific what. Rather, it refers to the distinct givenness or how of experience. How that what is a part of my experience. It refers to the first personal presence of experience. And anybody who denies the for meness or mineness of experience simply fails to recognize an essential constitutive aspect of experience. Such a denial would be tantamount to a denial of the first person perspective. It would entail the view that my own mind is either not given to me at all, I would be mind blind or self blind, or present to me in exactly the same way as the minds of others. So yeah, Zahavi is just but guys, it really seems like my experience is mine, so therefore there has to be a me to possess the experience, right? So this is, gosh, yeah. So let's just, I guess, get through it. There we go. Ohm and Romome are becoming friends, and that's awesome. Uh, okay, very good. And Ohm, I remind you of the challenge. I see that you totally believe in something. I remind you of the challenge. It's scary of not totally believing in anything and just trying to follow the evidence and having beliefs be more on a sliding scale, more about probability. So, just as we saw Strawson presuming that the existence of the self is unchallengeable, here we see Zahavi asserting that to deny the reality of this forminess simply fails to recognize an essential constitutive aspect of experience. It is always a good idea to be suspicious of this kind of table pounding. Just as I think that we should challenge the existence of the self, I think that we should wonder whether for meness is an essential element of our experience, and even if we thought that it was, whether this would entail that there is a me for whom my experience is present, where that me is understood as a self. We will now see that there is reason to reject both of these claims. So first, note that Zahavi argues that the property of forminess is what distinguishes my own experiences from those of others, but that can't be. For if he is even close to correct, your experiences have this property as well. From your perspective, those experiences are for me, just as from my perspective, my experiences are for me. If all experiences have this property essentially, then we can't use it to distinguish among them. Okay, because he's not talking about for you-ness. Okay, this is an unexpected move and probably something that I want to look at again. So if all experiences have this property essentially, it's property of being for me, then we can't use it to distinguish among my experiences and your experiences. Moreover, if this is really the property that distinguishes my own experiences from yours, the property that lets me know that they are mine and not yours, I should be able to compare my experiences with yours, find for meness in mine, but not in yours, and so come to know that mine are mine and that yours are yours, and that makes no sense whatsoever. Okay. This part of the argument is hence just a shell game. It might well appear that the only way that I could know when I have an experience that it is mine and not yours would be to detect some telltale property of that experience that reveals it to be mine. In that case, if it lacked that property, then on noticing the experience, I would recognize it as yours, not mine. But I can't first have an experience and then wonder whose it is. Simply to have an experience is for it to be mine. So there is no property of all of my experiences, the presence of which announces them as mine. So there is no property. So there is no property. And you know what? I think that this is something for you to think about this idea of, because when you look at like Brahma, right, where all these awarenesses get unified. Well, I guess formness is not a part of the Advaita Vedanta, so never mind, actually. Okay, so this part of the argument is hence just a shell game. Let's read this again. It might well appear that the only way that I could know when I have an experience that it is mine and not yours would be to detect some telltale property of that experience, which lets me know, oh, okay, that one's mine. And then in that case, if I have an experience and it doesn't have that telltale property, then when I notice the experience, I would notice that it doesn't have that property, and so notice that it's not mine because that property indicates that it's mine. Okay, so you said that your experiences are indeed your own. Yeah, so interesting to kind of think about. So then how would we develop that once we've, because I mean, I don't really know enough, but what little I remember, so then you, the experiencer who has their own experiences, are going to unify in the afterlife with Brahma, right? In which case there will not be my experience and your experience. There's just the universal and unified pure awareness, right? Is that right? Okay. So this telltale property. Oh, look, it doesn't have it. So it must be yours and not mine. But I can't first have an experience and then go, oh, what property does it have? Because as soon as I have the experience, it's gonna be mine, right? And nobody has ever had an experience and been like, "Oh, this experience isn't mine." Actually, not true. There are cases of either being under in duress or extreme conditions or mental illness or something where you can feel dissociated from your own experience and your own memory. I hope that he covers that because I can't think of like specific examples right now, but I mean that has to be possible, even if we haven't found a case of it yet. So there is no property of all of my experiences, the presence of which announces those experiences are as mine. There's not a property. Let me know. Oh, hey, if this property is present, this label is present, whatever, that, oh, okay, then that experience is mine. Simply because there is no property without which I would know them to be someone else's. What would it be like to have an experience, notice that there was no for me-ness in it, and then conclude that it was yours? So, like, if Jay had an experience, or if I have an experience, it has no for me-ness in it, and then I conclude that it's yours. What would that be like? This is one way of making the broader point that experiences themselves don't have their own subjective properties. The properties of experiences are all properties of the contents of experience, not of the subject. The fact that my experiences are mine can never entail that I am a self as opposed to a person, just as the fact that my dog is mine can't entail that I am a self as opposed to a person. Okay, I believe we are intrinsically connected to the divine, whether one refers to it as Brahma, Shiva, or Krishna. Very good. What would I have to offer you to consider other to consider empirically founded recent answers to these questions? I guess you are considering them. What would I have to offer you to see to keep seeing? Because you've shown me some evidence of your considerations, and I love that, and I want to encourage that. But also, I just love that you're here. So I think I take back asking for anything more. I do. Okay, so there is a reason that that Zahavi's argument has a ring of plausibility. It trades on the correct observation that you have your experiences and I have mine, but that banal fact doesn't imply that mine are mine in virtue of possessing some mysterious property. After all, the fact that I refer to myself as I and refer to you as you doesn't mean that I have I-ness and you have you-ness. Since the fact that I am me and you are you doesn't implicate any special I-ness and you-ness properties, I don't need to detect them in order to tell myself from you. In exactly the same sense, the fact that my experiences are mine and yours are yours doesn't entail that I detect for me-ness in mine and not in yours, even though I know when I have them that my experiences are indeed mine. Not only can this putative property not do the work of distinguishing between streams of experience, but we should wonder whether it is in fact an essential and constitutive aspect of experience at all. As I have now argued several times, while it might be true that we sometimes thematize ourselves as subjects in our higher order awareness of our mental states, it is almost certainly not true that we always do so. When we are immersed in activity, we are aware of the world around us, aware of the foci of our attention, but often not at all aware of ourselves as subjects. Yeah, I want to reach that level of meditation. I'd probably have to actually start doing meditation to reach that level. But it's just funny because, yeah, a great thing about Buddhists and doing this meditation is that they can experience anatta. And then you can also do it with hallucinogenic drugs, dissolving the dissolution of the ego. Okay, so when we're immersed in activities such as meditation, we are aware of the world around us, aware of the foci of our attention, but not at all aware of the attention of ourselves as subjects. And if that is right, then we do not experience for me-ness whenever we experience anything else, just sometimes. Moreover, as we noted above, subject-object duality is better understood as a superimposition on a basically non-dual experience than as an essential or constitutive aspect of that experience, okay? Something that we cognitively superimpose, not something that we actually get from the experience. Subject-object duality, that is, reflects the way we represent our experience to ourselves when we are actively doing so, not the way we actually experience the world. Just as the apparent difference between the length of the lines in the Mueller-Lyer illusion is a feature of our perception of the lines, not of the lines themselves. Even that superimposition requires a non-dual immersion in introspection. Even that superimposition requires a non-dual immersion in introspection. Not sure I understand that. So, Zahavi's argument, one representative of the approach of many, but not all, of the new phenomenologists who defend the reality of the self, fails at 3 points. It fails to identify a property that distinguishes experiences as mine. It fails to demonstrate that that property is essential to experience. And it fails to demonstrate that even were that property detected in all experiences, that it would reveal the existence of a self. There's yet one more problem with this argument. And it connects directly to our... There is yet one more problem with this argument, and it connects directly to our previous discussion of subject-object duality as illusory. This philosophical exercise begins with the intuition, wow, yes, the world and the universe are all within. This is my perspective on the matter. And thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective, because, part of this channel is, as insistent as I've been that I want you to receive this stuff, part of this channel is for me to receive that stuff so that I can figure out the best ways to explain this stuff. There is yet one more problem with this argument, and it connects directly to our previous discussion of subject-object duality as illusory. This philosophical exercise begins with the intuition that experience involves a kind of interiority, an inner space in which experience occurs. Okay, this Cartesian theater, maybe. The foreminus to which Zahavi and others refer is a way of indicating location in this interior space. But this inner space is a myth, bro, or at best, a metaphor for an illusion. It is not the cranium or any other location in the interior of our bodies. In fact, there is nothing to which we can point of which our subjectivity is the interior. Experience, as I have been arguing, is better understood as a complex set of relations between a complex person or another kind of organism and the other complex aspects of the environment it inhabits, not as a replication of that environment in a dark inner space in consciousness. This is a context in which the most natural metaphor only gets us into trouble when we try to spell it out. Indian Buddhist philosophers talk about the tendency to see experience in terms of this replication of the world of objects in an interior space as an instance of ahamkara, literally the construction of an I. The emphasis here is on construction. We start with the metaphor of the inner and outer as a way of distinguishing ourselves from the rest of the world. This metaphor makes a certain amount of sense as a way of gesturing towards the greater access we have to our own psychological and somatic states than we do to those of other objects and persons. We then reify it, forgetting that it was only a metaphor in the first place, and freezing the metaphorical subjective side into an entity, or an inner space in which special inner events occur, hence creating a self as the referent of I. And we can go further. Even if we granted that the self so created was real, the very best we could get out of an argument such as Zahavi's would be not the self we reify and with which we identify, even if we granted that the self so created was real, the very best we could get out of an argument such as Zahavi's would be not the self we reify and with which we identify, not the object of negation of no self arguments, but instead a succession of momentary selves, one for each moment of experience. And you put those together and it's a person, bro. It's what, Garfield here defines as a person. So nothing in Zahavi's arguments yields the endurance of the subjective side of experience. Only, even were it successful, a subjective side of each experience. This is not the controller, the center of consciousness, the agent, the owner of mind and body that we take ourselves to be when we think of ourselves as selves. At best, this is the elephant, not the snake. The argument, in effect, concedes that there is no snake in the wall in the first place. Ohm says, in other words, when we are in a dream state during sleep, it is quite similar. You might consider the waking state as another form of sleep, the great illusion. In a lot of ways, I would, because, regardless, it's all happening in here. Whether you're imagining something or looking at something, it's still happening. Right there. Okay, so minimal selves now, an argument from intransitive self-consciousness. All right, so let me just go back. Okay, so this is all Zahavi. But what happened to what was Thompson? Okay, so Thompson ends there. Gotcha. Very good. Okay, now number 2. So now let's take a look at minimal selves, an argument from intransitive self-consciousness. So how do you go from intransitive self-consciousness, the fact that, self-consciousness, I guess, can't be just like passed on and it stays where it's at or something. How can we go from that to concluding that there is, albeit not transcendental, a minimal, some smaller, some less version, some lighter version of still an enduring self? All right, so much for arguments from Forminus. Let us now turn to the second major line of argument advanced by the new phenomenologist. Evan Thompson's argument for a special kind of intransitive self-consciousness that is meant to deliver the reality of a minimal self. So we've got some more Thompson. So this argument is closely connected to those we have just discussed, but Thompson's approach attempts to evade the problems besetting a reflexivity theory by treating self-consciousness not as reflexive, but as intransitive. Okay. A transitive consciousness is one in which a subject is aware of something else. Okay, not as all what I was thinking. All right, so a transitive consciousness is one in which a subject is aware of something else, as when I am aware of the apple on my desk. Okie dokie. To be transitively aware of oneself would be to take oneself as an object, as when one looks into a mirror. The reflexive awareness we discussed above is, despite its reflexivity, transitive in this sense. This is not what Thompson has in mind when he appeals to intransitive self-awareness in order to show that the self is disclosed in consciousness. Instead, he wants to argue that awareness makes us directly aware of our subjectivity, not as an object, but as an immediately experienced aspect of our awareness of any object. Here's how he puts it. All right, but how do you put it again? So let's go back to the reflexive awareness we discussed above is, despite its reflexivity, transitive in this sense. Okay. Because it's like not sort of implicit, direct, immediate enough. It's still awareness of awareness. All right, so I don't get it yet. When he appeals to intransitive self-awareness in order to show that the self is disclosed in consciousness. Okay. Instead, he wants to argue that awareness makes us directly aware of our subjectivity. And that subjectivity, that awareness, is not an object of which we are aware, but it's an immediately experienced aspect of our awareness of any object. And maybe it's just semantic bullshit. I don't know, bro. Let's see. Every intentional experience both presents or represents its intentional object and discloses itself, but this disclosure is intransitive. Although the what question can arise from the transitive component of an intentional experience, it cannot arise for the intransitive component of pre-reflective self-awareness. In sum, every transitive consciousness of an object is pre-reflectively and intransitively self-conscious. Who's that person in the mirror? You can never really see your true self. You can only see your eyes and body, not who you truly are. Yes, absolutely, bro. Same page there. I can always ask what I see, hear, feel, or remember. That's the what question. Thompson emphasizes that this kind of question always makes sense with respect to an object of experience. But, he argues, this kind of question does not make sense for the subject. I cannot ask what sees the apple I now see. Thus, he concludes that subject must be taken for granted as existing, albeit in a minimal way, not as substance, but as that self which is disclosed in this intransitive self-consciousness. It's just, you know what? So sometimes I think about, like, I try to remember that I as in my species, might be the top-notch brains of the organisms currently alive. But that when you step back and you imagine what more can evolve, what has evolved on other planets, what could have evolved here but just didn't or got killed off, um, you realize that you don't really know the scale. And there's no reason to think that just the best mental capacities that we know of, like so far, are capable of knowing reality as it is. Okay, so how I try to remind myself of that is I just picture a gorilla in a lab, and I picture humans looking at that gorilla, and I take that and then I use that sort of as an analogy for a higher intelligence looking at me, um, or members of my species, um, and and I think about how there are things that this gorilla, based on whatever evidence we have, may probably whatever just has no concept of. There are things that this gorilla just cannot conceive of, right? And so then I think, oh, okay. So then there are also things that I cannot conceive of because, again, no reason to think that we have reached like peak maximum cognitive capacity, or even to think that peak maximum cognitive capacity could grasp reality. Um, and I think that's what drives me nuts about these non-empirical philosophers. They're like, "Hey, I was able to put all these sentences together that seem pretty darn convincing to me. Therefore, I've just proven what reality is." Like GTFOH. All right. Versus an intransitive. All right, so I can always see, yeah, I can always ask what I see, hear, feel, or remember. That is the what question. So Thompson emphasizes that this kind of question always makes sense with respect to an object of experience, but he argues this kind of question does not make sense for the subject. I cannot ask what sees the apple I now see. Thus, he concludes that that subject must be taken for granted as existing, albeit in a minimal way, not as substance, but as that self which is disclosed in this intransitive self consciousness. All right, sure. There's actually a version of that can work as the self that is constructed. Change like one word, maybe. So, should we be convinced? I think not, bro. The clear kinship of this argument to that proffered by Zahavi suggests that it suffers from the same kinds of difficulties, and this is, in fact, the case. Our work in the previous section allows us to state the difficulties briefly. First, we can ask what is disclosed in a non-transitive way. Okay, we can grant that when I see an apple, the fact that I am seeing an apple is disclosed. Nonetheless, it does not follow that a self is disclosed as the subject of that seeing, only that an apple is seen. Nothing follows regarding nothing follows regarding what is doing that seeing. Nothing follows regarding what is doing that seeing. If what is at stake is the difference between a self and a person, nothing at all follows from the fact that I see an object that could settle that question. Ohm says, scientists estimate that the probability of your existence is approximately 1 in 400 trillion. Given this singular opportunity, it is imperative to ascertain your intrinsic nature and purpose. Yes! Thank you, I am absolutely desperate for you to learn from research, from neuroscience, right? I am, and you can do it. We can sort of be wearing our own shoes, even be on our own paths, but kind of, head in the same direction and using the same material. So, on the same path, we can discover together. And we have different starting points, but we can discover together. So let's listen to scientists. By the way, the probability of my existence is 1 in 1. Hi. But I definitely understand what I think I definitely understand what you're saying. And so let's not just stay stuck in, whatever perspective we were initially assigned, or even whatever perspective felt most compatible with the mechanisms that we were initially assigned. Let's try to reduce, to minimize the effect of our perspective, our training, and so on, and rely as much as possible on empiricism and move forward. Progress. Yes. Love it. You're like my best friend. This is so exciting. So, where were we? So, so our work in the previous section allows us to state the difficulties briefly with Thompson's argument, because we kind of saw the same problems with Zahavi's argument. So first, we can ask what is disclosed in this non-transitive way. So we can grant that when I see an apple, the fact that I'm seeing an apple is disclosed. Nonetheless, it does not follow that a self is disclosed as the subject of that seeing, only that an apple is seen. Nothing follows regarding what is doing that seeing. If what is at stake is the difference between a self and a person, well, nothing at all follows from the fact that I see an object that could settle that question. Okay, nothing about me seeing an object tells us about whether it's a self or a person that I am, whether I am a self or a person. Okay, so second, as I argued above, the fact that a subject-object duality appears in my own introspective awareness of the experience of seeing the apple does not even mean that there is a subject to be disclosed. Reprogramming oneself yields significant cognitive benefits as the brain functions as hardware and the mind as software. Yeah, yes, learning is super beneficial. Yeah, I mean, I reject the whole brain mind, or the value of the brain mind distinction, or the hardware software metaphor. But yes, do I reject that? When that subject is okay, so the fact that this subject-object duality appears in my own introspective awareness of the experience of seeing the apple does not even mean that there is a subject to be disclosed when that subject is understood as something standing over and against the object. It entails only that there is a perceptual process in which an embodied person is embedded, and that I introspectively represent that process as dual. Once again, so long as we do not confuse the person with the self, there is not even the appearance of an argument for the reality of a self to be found here, or even for the subject-object duality that entails the reality of a unitary subject. The argument from non-transitive self-consciousness thus fails as well to establish the reality of the self. So far in this chapter, we have gone from reflexive arguments to arguments from a vague sense of for-me-ness to arguments from intransitive self-awareness for the reality of a substantial self, each relying on a thinner reed in order to save the self. We have seen that despite their historical importance and current popularity, none is convincing. But that is not the end of the story. Perhaps that self-awareness is not reflexive, not directed on for-me-ness, and not even simply intransitive, but a kind of pre-reflective background to consciousness that nonetheless is sufficient to deliver the reality of the self. We will consider this last desperate strategy before turning to narrative accounts. Okay. Very good. I mean, just all of these ideas involve some non sort of established, observed, necessitated by empiricism thing, and how frustrating. So pre-reflective self self-awareness. Evan Thompson, in his later work, defends an even more minimal view of the self than that in his earlier work, one according to which the self is simply constituted by a kind of pre-reflective self-awareness. And it is worth quoting him on this issue. Responding to Thomas Metzinger's argument against the existence of a substantial persistent self, Thompson writes, "The problem with this argument, with Metzinger's argument, is that it rests on a tendentious concept of the self. Metzinger assumes that self means a personal essence inhering in an individual substance. He denies that there is such a thing and therefore concludes that selves do not exist, but this conclusion follows only given his concept of the self. His argument requires the premise that for something to be a self, it must be a single, unique, unified, and independent thing with a personal essence. Some philosophers have conceived of the self in this way, but many others have not." Note that the analysis of the self with which Thompson charges Metzinger is pretty much the one we have taken as our target so far. In Metzinger's choice to characterize, hello, Rome, Romome, new Romome. Ohm said hi to you earlier, so give Ohm a hello. Note that the analysis of the self with which Thompson charges Metzinger is pretty much the one we have taken as our target so far, and Metzinger's choice to characterize the self in this way is not arbitrary. As we saw in the first chapter, this is the way that we instinctively take ourselves to exist. One might use the word self to refer to something else and then demonstrate that that other thing exists, but to do that, as we will see that Thompson does, is to commit the error that Candrakirti lampoons. Dispelling a... well, it says a, not an. Would have thought I would have said dispelling a concern about an elephant when you were originally concerned about a snake. But to do that, to demonstrate that this other thing that I'm defining as a self doesn't exist, is to commit the same error that Candrakirti lampoons, dispelling a belief in an elephant to reassure oneself that there is no snake. Here is how Thompson suggests that we think of the self. Self-awareness takes different forms. According to phenomenologists, a minimal form of self-awareness is a constant structural feature of any conscious experience. They call this kind of self-awareness pre-reflective. This means that the awareness happens before we do any reflecting on our experience and that it's implicit rather than explicit. The idea is that every conscious experience appears to itself without any reflection or thought as a conscious experience. Or, to put it another way, that all experiencing involves implicitly experiencing that very experiencing. According to phenomenologists, pre-reflective self-awareness is necessary for the other kinds of self-awareness and then constitutes the sense of self in its minimal form. Oh, great. We've got a... is that Francis, who has said hello to... oh, wow. Just feel like we're a gang now, bro. Okay, so, note that Thompson draws our attention to two matters that must be disentangled for clarity. The first is the self. Okay, note that Thompson draws our attention to two matters that must be disentangled for clarity. The first is the self, the second is self-awareness. And it is the reality and indeed the ubiquity of implicit pre-reflective self-awareness on which Thompson insists here. Okay, so Thompson insists on the reality and indeed the ubiquity of implicit pre-reflective self-awareness. All right? This, we will see, is a species of the reflexive awareness we discussed earlier. But for now, let us see that one cannot argue from the reality or even the necessity of self-awareness to the reality of the self. I will begin by demonstrating the invalidity of the central inference in the argument. That is, I will show that it is quite possible to accept this implicit self-awareness as a real psychological phenomenon while taking the self to be non-existent. Okay? In fact, that it is just what it is to say. In fact, that is, I will show that it is quite possible to accept this implicit self-awareness as a real psychological phenomenon while taking the self to be non-existent. In fact, that it is just what it is to say that the self is an illusion. In fact, gotcha. In fact, that is just what it is to say that the self is an illusion, that it appears to exist, but in fact does not. Consider as an analogy the structure of our visual field. We experience it pre-reflectively, implicitly, and ubiquitously as uniformly colored with no holes in it. But it is well known that this is an illusion. Okay? You ever done one of these? One that we are wired to project. There is a hole at the very center of the visual field, a blind spot where the optic nerves enter the retina, and so where there are no photoreceptive cells. Moreover, we are sensitive to color only in the middle of our visual field. Over half of that field is in fact available to the retina only in black and white. Our visual system fills in the hole and paints in the colors for us, despite receiving no information at all from the very center of the field and no color information from the periphery. Our visual experience does not reflect what our senses deliver. It is a construction, not a registration. And something so relevant to this. Not only do we have this blind spot that gets filled in, not only is all this shit black and white and we're filling it in, back here. Not only that, but when you move your eyes, do little eye saccades, let's say you walk into a room that you've never been in, and you're noticing it, you're observing it. Page 285 in John Brockman's This Explains Everything, which is a bunch of really important essays about us and the world. We have The Wizard of Eye, written by Gerald Smallberg, a doctor and a playwright, a practicing neurologist and a playwright of off-Broadway production. So I'm just going to read... I think I am gonna... Oh, it's only a page. Should we just read the whole thing? I think we are gonna do that. So, consciousness is the fusion of immediate stimuli with memory that combines the simultaneous feeling of being both the observer and the observed into a smooth, enveloping flow of time that is neither truly the past nor the present, but somehow, inexplicably, each of them. It is the ultimate authority and arbiter of our perceptual reality. That consciousness is still an intractable problem for scientists and philosophers to understand is not surprising. Whatever the final answer turns out to be, I suspect it will be an illusion the mind evolved to hide the messy workings of its parallel modular computing. And you can basically treat self and consciousness as interchangeable references to the same subject, okay? The same illusion. Neurophysiologists are finding, as they pull ever so slightly at the veil that shrouds the wizard of eye, that this indispensable, attentive, and observant self-monitor called consciousness is dependent on a trick in overseeing our perceptions. Our subjective sense of time does not correspond to reality. Cortical evoked potentials, electrical recordings of the normal brain during routine activity, have been shown to precede, by almost a third of a second, the awareness of an actual willed movement or a response to sensory stimulation. The LeBay style studies. The cortical evoked potentials indicate that the brain is initiating or reacting to what is happening far sooner than the instantaneous perception we experience. On a physiological scale, this represents a huge discrepancy that our mind corrects by falsifying the actual time an action or event occurs, thus enabling our conscious experience to conform to what we perceive. But data even more damaging to our confidence in the reliability, of our perceptions comes from studies of rapid eye movements called saccades that are triggered by novel visual stimuli. During the brief moments of these jerky eye movements, visual input to the brain is actively suppressed. Okay, so when you move your eyes quickly like that, okay, you look around, you move your eye quickly. Visual information, right, from here. So the light's impinging on that, and then that's supposed to travel down the optic nerve and to the visual cortex, okay? So that information from the eye isn't going from the eye, okay? It's being stopped, it's being suppressed. There's signals shutting that shit down, bro, before it can get to the visual centers, right? So the brain is seeing black, is not getting visual information, well, parts of it anyway, from the eyes. And then, as we're going to see, so then it fills it in, okay, such that other parts of the brain are seeing constructed images, not images coming from the sense organ. Okay. So during the brief moments of these jerky eye movements, visual input to the brain is actively suppressed. We are literally blind. Without this involuntary ocular censorship, we would be repeatedly plagued with moments of acute blurred vision that would be unpleasant as well as unsafe. From a survival calculus, this would pose an extreme disadvantage since it would invariably occur with novel stimuli, which by their very nature, being new, require not the worst but the best visual acuity to see what's going on. The wizard's solution to this intolerable situation is to exclude those intervals from our stream of awareness and replace them instead with a vision extrapolated from what just occurred to what is immediately anticipated. Consciousness, like a former president, has to come up with an accounting for the erased period. Evolution provided a much longer blah, blah, blah. So instead of trying to hide the existence of like the original stream of information, consciousness came up with a far cleverer trick of obscuring the deletion, the suppression of the visual data. It does this by falsifying the time, backdating those necessary moments so that there is no appearance of any gap. This illusion of visual continuity from inference and extrapolation reveals an innate vulnerability in the brain's software that any good hacker can exploit, and magicians, card sharks, and three-card Monte hustlers do so. They made a nice living working this perceptual flaw. Okay. Ohm says, your mind is more like a process, a flow of conscious and subconscious activity than a physical thing in one spot. Yeah, it's more like an event. Yeah, definitely. Great. Some theories say your mind isn't just in your head, but also in your body and how you interact with the world. Some do. And then the question is, what does the research support? Okay, so, nonetheless, okay, so our visual experience does not reflect what our senses deliver. It is a construction, not just a registration. Nonetheless, we remain blissfully unaware of this operation as we behold the visible world. One cannot then argue from the awareness of uniformity to the actual uniformity of that of which we are aware. And for the same reason, one cannot argue that simply because I am self-aware, that there is a self of which I am aware. Okay? All right, sure, I am self-aware. I'm aware of some of my processes. But that doesn't mean that my processes can be attributed are identical to a singular substance, continuous enduring substance. Note further that if this argument were sound, one could argue that because I have an awareness of being followed while walking down a lonely road in the dark, there is someone following me of whom I am aware. But of course you can have this sense, oh, someone's following me, and there's nobody flipping following you. We will return to this issue in a moment, as it is a serious problem at this stage of Thompson's argument. But first, let us ask whether the principal premise in this argument, the claim that a minimal form of self-awareness is a constant structural feature of any conscious experience, is that even true? I, for one, do not see why anyone would accept this claim. But in order to refute the claim, we must be clear about what Thompson has in mind. As he notes a bit later, this is not meant to be the claim that we are explicitly aware of ourselves in every moment, a claim that would be manifestly false. We therefore cannot reply to Thompson by denying the reality of that explicit kind of self-awareness, as he will respond that we are confusing explicit with implicit awareness, and that correctly denying that we are explicitly self-aware whenever we are conscious does not undermine the claim that we are implicitly self-aware whenever we are conscious. So let us ask what this minimal or implicit self-awareness that is less than explicit reflective self-awareness might be. What is this minimal implicit self-awareness, and how it is meant to differ from having no self-awareness at all? You are now reading the words on this page. You are now watching me read the words on this page, and you can also look at the bottom and you can be reading the words on this page. You are aware of the words and of the topic under discussion. Are you, in that act of reading and of thinking, also aware, even implicitly, of yourself being aware? Even when we bear in mind the claim that this is not meant to be explicit awareness available in introspection or the content of an occurrent thought, I see no reason to believe that I am. But how would you see a reason? Because Thompson's done a really good job of being like, yeah, but this is invisible self-awareness. If that awareness were really a precondition of any other kind of awareness, it would appear to follow both that I could not be aware of the words without being aware of myself reading them, and that I could not be aware of myself reading them unless I was also pre-reflectively aware of myself being pre-reflectively aware of being myself reading them. A nasty regress looms. It is worth noting that this is a regress of actual, not potential awareness, and referring to it as implicit, prethetic, or intransitive does not make it any less actual. It kind of seems like it's trying to, though. Each act of awareness... Sweet. Each act of awareness on this view presupposes another actual prethetic awareness. I don't know what prethetic means. Probably look it up on my phone. Prethetic. I have no ideas of what that might mean. Thetic. Oh, like there's a prosthetic? Show results with thetic. Titik. Okay, Bloomsbury Philosophy Library. Non-thetic, prethetic, site under maintenance. So I'm looking for thetic. It all just seems like gorilla thoughts. Gorilla gibberish. Yeah, I think I'm over this. But basically we get it. It's just the same. It's just another word for this like implicit, pre-reflective, bop, bop, bop. Okay. So a nasty regress looms. And relax. Absolutely. I am so, so honored that we're spending this time together, and that you like watching this before you go to bed, and that you like relaxing to it. Um, Gosh, I am blushing, and you just can't tell because you're on your phone. So, a nasty regress looms. It is worth noting that this is a regress of actual, not just potential awareness, and referring to it as implicit, prethetic, or intransitive does not make it any less actual. Each act of awareness on this view each act of awareness on this view presupposes another actual prethetic awareness that makes it aware, and it is the fact that this is a regress of actual awarenesses, not merely potential awarenesses, that makes it a vicious regress. To disarm the regress, a defender to disarm the regress, a defender of this argument would have to take the awareness in question to be merely potential, and to rephrase the premise as the claim that I can always become aware of myself as subject whenever I am aware of something else, should I care to reflect. Alrighty then, the ensuing regress would then be harmless, like the counting regress we considered earlier, where we said, so here would be an actual vicious regress, as Garfield taught us earlier with counting. So I can count to 2, right? I can count to 3, right? What's this? 1, 2, 3. I could even count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the fact that I could potentially just like keep going and count to the highest, countable value, number, whatever, doesn't mean wait, what is it? It's a potential. It's not a vicious regress because it's only potential. We're not saying that I'm always counting one number up. Wait, what? Why am I confused right now? Hold on a second. So a vicious regress is when you're talking about that each layer necessitates the next layer in order for what? That every time there is a layer of awareness, it guarantees another layer of awareness. Then that means that you just have like infinite layers of awareness. So that's vicious. So every time you count up a number, if that necessitates that you count up another number, well, you wouldn't actually be able to count up to the highest number. And so we could say, oh, so then you can't count up a number. But that would be the vicious regress. But we're not saying that every time I count a number, it necessitates that I count the next number. We're just saying that it's potential. So now we don't have to imagine a world where I'm literally counting every number. It's terribly explained because there's something I'm missing. So a vicious regress is vicious, is impossible, is incoherent when it involves an infinite number of things happening. And it is incoherent. Oh, so it's not about the highest. Okay, I know what I was missing. I'm not going to get into it. Okay, so, but basically the point is that my ability to count up another number is absolutely fine. Doesn't like threaten my ability to count up a number but if I was saying that every time I count a number, then I count the next number and it's this infinite chain. Now we're going to go, actually, you wouldn't be able to do that infinite thing, so I'm not sure that you can count a number. Something like that. Okay. So to disarm the regress, a defender of this argument would have to take the awareness in question to be merely potential and to rephrase the premise as the claim that I can I can always become aware of myself as subject whenever I'm aware of something else, should I care to reflect. The ensuing regress would then be harmless, like the counting regress we considered earlier, but this is cold comfort for the friend of reflexivity, for it replaces actual immediate self awareness with merely potential higher order awareness of a cognitive state. By the way, my argument for why it's a bit silly that the philosophers he's responding to think that they've achieved something by putting, sentences together that make sense is also something I could say for Garfield in his response to them. And it is something that I'm saying. Okay. So the basic premise of this argument is at the very least problematic and probably false. And a merely potential higher order awareness is insufficient, as we have seen, to ground the reality of the self. We're going to review that. Because I don't think I could articulate that off rip like this right now. So, and a merely potential higher order awareness is insufficient, as we have seen, to ground the reality of the self. No, right? Yeah, I guess there are parts of me that get it, but they're not verbal right now. So, and I don't feel like I get it. It just feels like parts of me that don't really feel like me. Which obviously is relevant, but I'm thinking about how much we have to read. But luckily, we only have 5 pages left in this chapter, and then maybe we take a little break, and then we do chapter 6. All right, 15, 17. All right. Anyone who it is merely the possibility. So the basic premise of this argument is at the very least problematic and probably false, and a merely potential higher order awareness is insufficient, as we have seen, to ground the reality of the self. It is merely the possibility that one cognitive state can take another as its object. Right. Right. Now I do get it. Yes. Okay. So because if you want to ground the reality of the self, then you have to say that like every mechanism or every mental event necessitates or guarantees an awareness of that thing. And you have to then show continuity of that, because that was a problem we saw recently. So that it's not just awareness of each experience. But if you're just saying that it's not necessitated, then you can just say, okay, well, then there's another thing interacting with it, that can or cannot interact with it, or can have that relation. But because they're not one and the same, it's not a guaranteed implicit automatic thing. Okay, I kind of just strung words together, but also it felt like understanding, so we're going to keep it moving. Anyone who wants to use this argument to defend the existence of even a minimal self needs that awareness to be actual, and that lands one in the vicious regress. So much for the premise of Thompson's argument, but suppose that we grant it, accepting for the sake of argument that I am pre-reflectively aware of myself in every moment of consciousness. The existence of a self would still not follow. To move from the relatively innocuous, although possibly psychologically false, claim that we have a sense that we are a self at each moment of our lives, probably psychologically false that we have a sense that we are a self at each moment of our lives. To move from that anyway to the stronger claim that this is evidence that we have a self in the sense that we take ourselves to have one is a straightforward non sequitur. That inference requires a further premise, viz., that this sense of self is veridical, that merely the fact that we have that cognitive state, this sense of self, makes the belief to which it gives rise true, that there's actually a self. No, bro. Not guaranteed. Your impression is not an indication of reality. Your impression don't impress, bro. That is a premise that neither Thompson nor any of the partisans of this position defends, and for good reason. To assume that premise in this context is to beg the question, since the very accuracy of our own sense of who we are is what is up for debate. One might attempt to avoid begging the question by retreating to the claim that the self just consists in the reflexive awareness of a moment of consciousness by itself. One might attempt to avoid begging the question by retreating to the claim that the self just consists in the reflexive awareness of a moment of consciousness by itself, as Thompson suggests in the passage we just quoted. But as a defense of the existence of the self, this is a non-starter. Nobody takes themselves to be a moment of reflexive awareness in a moment of consciousness. That is Kundrakirti's elephant. To get to something that looks more like a self in this context, we would need to posit something standing behind all moments of consciousness that is aware of them. That would indeed be the serpent in the wall, but as Thompson himself acknowledges, even a pervasive, minimal, implicit maybe Michelle Davis Vulcan Princess asked if this is a breach of copyright. Maybe, but now I'm thinking no, it isn't. It's for educational purposes, and I'm not just here like reading the book. I often worry that people are gonna be mad at me because I am responding to it, clarifying it, interpreting it, and so on. Okay, so Thompson concludes. Yeah, because also if you want to read this book and then you did it by watching me for hours, working through it, that wouldn't be very efficient. So the book is one thing, and then me reading it and studying it and preparing for the interview with the author is something else. I think it's fair use. So Thompson concludes. Okay. So if you had this implicit self-awareness that is standing behind all moments of consciousness, that would be the serpent in the wall. But as Thompson himself acknowledges, even a pervasive, minimal, implicit self-consciousness can't get you there. Thompson concludes, from the phenomenological perspective, the self is a multifaceted construction made out of different kinds of self-awareness, not an unconstructed personal essence or independent thing. Given this viewpoint, there are no grounds for saying that the self is an illusion. Although illusions are mental constructions, not all mental constructions are illusions. There's a traditional Buddhist way to make this point. It requires making a terminological and conceptual distinction between self, Atman, and person, Purgala. If we restrict self to mean a personal essence that is the independent owner of experience and agent of action, and we use person to refer to the multifaceted construction that includes modes of self-awareness, to the multifaceted construction that includes modes of self-awareness, then we can say that whereas the self is an illusion or non-existent fiction, the person exists. In other words, from the perspective of Buddhist philosophy, my argument that the self is a construction can be taken as an argument for the claim that the person is a construction. Yes, indeed, this all sounds very plausible, but it takes us back to where we started. Thompson, like the man with the snake in the wall of his house, has redefined self to mean person and has argued that the person is a real construction. He has then concluded that the self so understood is real. There's nothing wrong with redefining terms, and there's nothing wrong with using the word self to mean person, but nobody has ever denied that persons exist or even that personhood is constructed. So to argue that persons exist is beside the point, bro. Thompson has therefore not successfully defended the reality of the self we instinctively posit. At best, he has only changed the meaning of the words and conceded that we are persons, not selves. This concludes our discussion of phenomenological approaches to defending the reality of a minimal self. Even the thinnest of these conceptions fails to capture a real self. We now turn to the final, most minimal contemporary strategy for rescuing the self. The idea that the self is a narrative construction. We will see, not surprisingly, that in thinning the self even further in order to save it, this strategy too ends up defending the reality of persons and conceding the unreality of selves. Okie dokie. So, persons and narrative. And the other author that I am interviewing on the same day that I'm interviewing this this author definitely subscribe to the narratives. I'm so glad I'm reading this. So this gives me, so I can, I think I'll probably end up saying like, hey, um, because because yeah, totally, absolutely. Because she even said to me in our first meeting that she's like, what do people mean when they say the self is an illusion? Because if we define the self as XYZ, okay, fine, it's an illusion, but and then she just doesn't think that that's how people use the word self, or that that's how in people's minds the self is defined. So one point of contention is between these two authors, well, yeah, between us, me and this author, and the other author, Dr. Schechtman, um, is Garfield and I, we agree that people conceive of the self as XYZ, the same XYZ that Dr. Schechtman was referring to, and that by and that so yeah, so that's one thing about how people define the self. And then the other thing is about how useful it is to use the word self when you're talking about a narrative construction. Okay. All right, so this section, persons and narrative. 3 more pages, and then we are done with really going through the philosophical elaborations of the illusion of self. All right, so persons and narratives and narrative. Some proponents, some all right, some proponents of the reality of the self would agree that none of the arguments we have just considered are any good. They concede that it makes no sense to talk of a substantial self, however minimal. Despite their commitment to the reality of a self, they do not conceive of that self as a substance, or even in any sense as a primordial independent self. Instead, these contemporary self theorists argue we each have a constructed or narrative self. Daniel Hutto defends the view that our identity is constituted by the autobiographical narratives we tell, and that these narratives are the basis of our subjectivity. There is both something deeply right and something deeply wrong about this idea. Let us tease out the insight from the error. Okay, I see. So maybe this is Michelle Davis Fulkin. Maybe this is a violation of copyright. And maybe when I told the author that I'm reading this on stream, that's why he didn't respond. Hopefully, he will respond, though, when we are coming up on the meeting. Thank you, Om. So let's see. And then also, wouldn't I have to be like passing it off as my own Om and Princess Michelle? Okay, so Daniel Hutto defends the view that our identity is constituted by the autobiographical narratives we tell, and that these narratives are the basis of our subjectivity. There is both something deeply wrong and right and something deeply wrong about this idea. Let us tease out the insight from the error. Here's what is right. Our identities as persons in part consist in the roles we play in the collective narrative in which we figure. We have seen this idea introduced in chapter 3, and we will return to it in more detail in chapters 8 and 9. Hey, Rado. Thanks for... Oh, great. Awesome. Oh, no, I thought that was Rado that reassured me. But also, great. Thank you, for the reassurance. Okay. So we have seen this idea of these collective, of this our identity. So here's what is right. Our identities as persons in part consist in the roles we play in the collective narrative in which we figure. We have seen this idea introduced in chapter 3, and we will return to it in more detail in chapters 8 and 9. Yeah, no, I gotta leave it available. I'll just take a lawsuit, bro. I'd just rather take a lawsuit, bro. Because also I would be really against it that like we're not allowed to like read this and so on together. I mean, Jesus, this is some of the most important stuff and some of the least known, least, exposed, exhibited information. And, people need to know. So hopefully it'll be all right. Or maybe we'll be able to make a change to our, and all this stuff's changing anyway. So no, but I mean, I want people to be able to go through and look at the playlist and read through this and learn from this. Um, yeah. So, as persons, we play roles, and roles require a narrative context in order to make sense. But we must be careful not to confuse. For me, I think the key thing, and then I'll just move on because we're 3 pages away from ending this chapter. For me, I think the key thing is, would someone watch this video if their main goal is to read or to to absorb Garfield's book? And I think the answer would be no. I think that anybody who is hanging out here watching this, that their main goal is something else, like entertainment, like watching me, like seeing what I come up with. Maybe I don't really know, but yeah, if the 70% or more of their sort of desire consisted of knowing Garfield's thoughts, then I think they would just buy the book, which is linked in every description and in the description of the playlist. Okay, so back to my possible copyright infringement. Okay, so as persons, we play roles, and roles require a narrative context in order to make sense. But we must be careful not to confuse the personhood constituted by these narratives with the kind of basic identity or pure subjectivity assigned to selves. It is one thing to say that our personhood is constituted by narrative, and another to say that our very subjectivity is. To be sure, persons are in part constituted through narratives and through participation in the norm-governed practices that make narrative possible. Nonetheless, no proponent of the reality of the self, as distinct from the person, could take narratives as the basis of that reality. For the self is meant to be that which makes subjectivity possible in the first place, and we must already have subjectivity in order to be able to tell stories about ourselves. Okay, that's really important. Says if you're interviewing the author, just ask his permission. If it's fine, and maybe get it in writing, and you'll be fine. Yeah, good. Yeah, good. That's good. I'll be sure to do that. It follows that narrative identity cannot be the ultimate basis of subjectivity, even though it might well be the basis of personhood. Obviously, a proponent of the no-self view owes us an account of the basis of subjectivity, and we will come to that. But that is not the point here. The point is rather that a proponent of the reality of the self cannot appeal to narrative as its basis. To do so would be to abandon the project for which the self was posited in the first place, and to confuse the self with the person. And this is why the distinction between the self and the person is so important. While persons are what we are, selves are what we take ourselves to be. And to take ourselves to be selves is to succumb to a pernicious and incoherent delusion, albeit a delusion that comes perfectly naturally to us. And he said this a number of times, but I love the different ways that he says this. But to claim that because we are not selves, we are also not persons would be an equally egregious error. And that would amount to denying our own reality. So, In order to affirm the reality of persons and to deny that of selves, we must be clear about the distinction between the two. We can agree with proponents of a narrative identity that the person is a construction and nonetheless that it is real, while denying that anything corresponds to the idea of a self. When we affirm that the reality of the person, when we affirm the reality of the person while denying the reality of the self, we are not simply regimenting our use of words in some technical or artificial way. We are making space for the clarification of the nature of persons and for the disillusion of the fantasy of the self, each of which is important to understanding who and what we are. I would add following Kondratirthi, Locke, Hume, and others, that to understand the construction of personhood, we need to go well beyond modes of self awareness and talk about collective discursive practices, including legal and narrative practices that constitute us as persons. We will discuss this in the closing chapters of this book, and we will see that one will never find a self in such practices. The important point here is that when we talk about our immediate sense of self, our atavistic sense of who we are, we do not take ourselves to be constructed or conventional or to be made out of different modes of self-awareness. That's the elephant. We take ourselves to be independent subjects and agents lying behind all of that. And that self grasping can't be rendered innocuous by changing our terminology and focusing on personal identity instead of the reality of the self. As I noted in chapter 1, Tsongkhapa calls our attention to two different kinds of self-grasping. Self-grasping due to bad philosophy and innate self-grasping. The first kind is theoretical and reflective, the second is instinctive. He claims that the first kind occurs when philosophers attempt to make sense of the illusion of the self by developing theories about its nature. So the first kind occurs when we're trying to justify the second kind. This is a bit like seeing a mirage and then developing a theory to explain why there is a pond over there, one that will tell us just how much water it contains. The best way to deal with bad philosophy, he says, is to refute it using good philosophy, and that is what I've been trying to do in this chapter. Innate self-grasping is harder. That powerful conviction that we are really selves arises not through careful reasoning, like we have been discussing in this chapter, but instead because the illusion is so irresistible. We simply feel like selves. That is like seeing the mirage. No matter how much reasoning one offers a desert traveler, and no matter how much that person accepts that the experience is illusory, the experience and the illusion persist. Okay, so I need some kind of a symbol for when he makes these general comments about the illusion of the self. But I don't think I'm gonna do that right now. I wish I had. Tomorrow I'm putting my language up on the wall, and so I'll be better positioned to do all that stuff. Okay, so no matter how much reasoning one offers a desert traveler, and no matter how much that person accepts that the experience is illusory, the experience and the illusion of the mirage persist. The only way to eliminate that pre-reflective sense that there must be water there is to put on polarizing sunglasses. That is, to effect a deep transformation in the way we perceive the world, and that's probably not doable. Tsongkhapa's advice is that the only long-term meditative exercise is capable Tsongkhapa's advice is that only long-term meditative exercise is capable of ridding us of the innate sense of self. It is too wired into our psyche to be extirpated just by doing philosophy. This is indeed one of the reasons that meditative practice is so important in Buddhist traditions. It is a vehicle through which philosophy can be transformative by allowing that philosophy to seep so deeply into our consciousness that it comes to shape our experience. No, disagree. No, disagree. And this goes back to oh, you missed something good. I'm almost done with the live stream, so just rewind and watch that last minute. And I will see you, and maybe you're going to go to bed, but otherwise I will see you in the next live stream when we're going to do chapter 6. So I was talking about how I'm not talking to Om, catching him up. I'm talking to everybody. That in a previous live, in a preview, when I was reading a previous chapter, I was talking about how um, two out of the three authors of self-illusion books that I've read, or well, am reading for this one, seem to might be Buddhist. Um, and that's how strong the illusion is. That even when you do neuroscience, even when you do philosophy, um, you're still like on this hunt for this singular self, even though none of the evidence that you're coming across supports it. And then it seems to be that, you know, that maybe one reason why Buddhism is like disproportionately represented in no self thinkers is that they have experienced no self. And so their meditation gave them new experiences to sort of overwrite or replace this really compelling axiomatic like instinct that we have that there is a self. So I don't think it's from the philosophy seeping in. Maybe, but then also with hallucinogenics, you can, get this and so on. Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, That is heartwarming. Says, it is a pleasure to observe your live streams once more. I find the learning experience highly beneficial. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. But it's not, I suspect it's not because of the philosophy seeping in. I mean, when people are in their lab doing research, it's not seeping in. Okay, maybe for it to seep in, you need to do meditation, but yeah, no, I don't think so. I think that there is a change in default mode network and parietal lobe activity such that many of the aspects of the self go away, such that you're able to experience engagement with the foci of your attention without experiencing at all the attention itself or the subject that is paying that attention. Of course, I've never actually experienced this, so I'm just doing my best to describe it based on things that I've read and heard. So I conclude this chapter with that thought, partly so that a reader who follows the arguments against the reality of the self but still feels the pull of the opposing position can see why that might be the case. But I also end this chapter with this reflection because I think that Tsongkhapa might have been a little too pessimistic. I agree with him that a transformation of vision is necessary to see beyond the self-illusion, but it just might be that that transformation can be achieved by closer attention to the times when that illusion is weakened or disappears. It is to those occasions that we now turn. How exciting. All right, so I'm gonna go pee, maybe make some coffee, check on Babe, see what's going on. I think I'll probably actually be back in like 15 to 20 minutes, honestly. Okay.